And then with FBNL, what was your title?
Well, my first job was field engineer. Uh, they gave me a position in Sanford, Florida, as a field engineer, and I started out. I remember, well, after I spent a month in Miami with orientation, just going through the different departments and learning about the company. That's all that was. Then I got to Sanford about March, and Diane joined me. She was staying with my parents in Mississippi during that time of orientation, and so we bought a house in Sanford, and that's when she went back to school after we got the house. And I was a field engineer. The first job that I remember was that my boss was up for promotion, and he was doing some temporary assignment in another department in Daytona. And after I had only been there a short time, he had to go over there, and so they just left me. It was just a two-man crew, just me and him, and we serviced the Sanford plant and all of the substations in the northern part of Florida up to Palatka and down to Melbourne. So it was a pretty good region we covered, because as many times I'd pack my suitcase on Monday and we'd go to work at a plant somewhere all week, and I'd come home on Friday. Well, Diane didn't like that, because she said, I put up with that in the Navy. So you're not in the Navy, this is a civilian job. So we tried to work it out. But anyway, my boss was gone. This was actually after I'd been there with only about a week. And the load control for the Sanford plant quit working. Now this is back in the days of vacuum tubes and tuned circuits and stuff. And the problem was this was a pulse system from the System Control Center in Miami to raise and lower the output of the plant. Well, it wouldn't work, so they had to use a manual system, where they had to actually raise by operating the governor of the generator to raise and lower the output of it. And that was done every 5 minutes on a phone call. Well, that was really hard on the operators. So they called me over there, and he was gone, and he says, can you fix it? I was brand new. First time I'd ever seen it. I went in the file, and there was an instruction book on how the thing worked. So I went in there, and well, okay, this didn't tune up right. So I tuned it up, replaced some tubes in the receiver. It receives the pulse from Miami, and got it all working again. And in about an hour and a half or so, and I remember turning to the operator and says, okay, you're good to go. And he looks at me and says, wow, that was fast. He says, it usually takes all day to get these things fixed. And I says, well, I'm new at it. I didn't know I was supposed to take that long. Anyway, since I had an experience as a ham radio operator, I had worked with electronics, and this was all the same stuff. It was radio transmitters and stuff. Well, that's no big deal. I built my own. And so it wasn't a big deal. So anyway, after about 6 months, my boss took a temporary position, and they said, well, we want to get somebody senior person to be the supervisor in that area. And then I remember the manager of the department came to me and says, there isn't anybody. Can you run it if we give you some help? And I said, sure. So I can run it. So I became the supervisor after 6 months. I was still a probationary employee.
But now you're running it.
And I'd run it, and they sent me a brand new guy, just graduated from school, that had never done anything with electronics. He had a degree, but he had never had hands-on other than laboratory work. So I had to train him to be a helper, but it worked out. I mean, he knew the principles and stuff, so it wasn't very big. So we took care of the area there for another year, and then a position came open. And in fact, it's interesting, my boss finally got promoted on a permanent basis to that other job, and a position came open in Fort Lauderdale, and they offered it to me. And I remember that because it was a big increase. I became the division relay engineer with a $25 a month increase in pay, and the company moved me to Fort Lauderdale. And from that, I took over the operation there for the next few years, and then I became an assistant manager in that area to train all of the other people. That was my main function, is training people. I had come up with some very innovative ways to test the protective relay systems of the power plants and substations, and took care of the batteries and stuff. And in fact, I came up with a procedure for increasing the life of batteries, showing them how they could, if they run them through these cycle tests. We had a very big problem down there because the station batteries are supposed to last 15 years, and they were failing after about 7 or 8 years. And I found out the reason was they just were not maintaining them properly, and I showed them how to do that. I had done that in the Navy, learned how to do that when I was on shore duty in the Navy. One of the functions was I was the electrical officer for the Navy base in Charleston, in charge of all of the tugboats. We had 26 tugboats that moved ships in and out, and harbor boats and oilers and patrol boats and all this, a whole bunch of small boats. And they all had starting batteries, big old Navy batteries. And the chief petty officer had shown me how to rejuvenate batteries, because a lot of the old batteries we had were, actually some of them dated back to World War II.
So were these like nickel or?
They're antimony batteries, primarily, either calcium batteries or antimony with the active agents. And one of the things they had as an old battery is you can, if you cycle them, discharge them and then charge them, discharge them and charge them, you can clean the plates up. And also you do that and you drop them, take them up and just jar them. And what it does, it shakes the stuff off of the chemicals off of the plates of the battery and makes it fall to the bottom. In fact, we've had some that had a shorted cell in it where the plates would swell a little bit, and then one next to it would swell and they would touch, so it would short out. But if you shake them hard, you could break that off and it would fall to the bottom of the battery. And anyway, I had done that in the Navy, learned how to do it. So the power company, I came up with this procedure for the power company and then showed others and taught them how to do it. And the manager in Miami liked what I was doing, so they promoted me to an assistant manager job in Fort Lauderdale, responsible for training not only the people in the Fort Lauderdale area but the whole region. So I did that for about 6 months, and then the general manager for the System Protection Department got promoted to Director of Power Supply, which head up the system operations and protective group, all of the field engineers in the company. And the position for manager of system protection came open. Well, there were a number of regional managers. There was actually 4 regional managers that had different regions of Florida, the West Coast and Northern Florida and Central Florida and then the Miami area. And they were normally the ones that would be in line for that job. But there was one interesting thing that happened. The manager should have a professional engineering license and also have a classification of some sort of security classification from that you can get, civilian security classification, because some of the stuff that we had to do for the control was actually classified. And they looked around, and none of the regional managers had their professional engineering license. None of them had an MBA, and none of them had security. So they looked around, and there's an assistant manager that's got all 3 of those. So I got promoted to the manager over all of those regional managers who were my bosses. So I became the big manager, the general manager of the whole department over them. Skipped the regional manager position. So it was a pretty nice increase and became the manager of that.
Did you make any enemies because of that?
No, actually they were very good people. I knew them all very well, and they were all very professional. Nobody really resented it. They all worked for me. Just I would bring them in for the regional meetings and we'd go through things, and they were all supportive of me. For one thing, the job was in Miami. I lived in Fort Lauderdale, so I commuted down there. And some of the ones that was more senior lived in other parts of the state and didn't want to move, so they thought it was just fine. In fact, I remember the Bill Ray over in Sarasota, Florida. He liked it there, and he didn't want to move, so he would have been a good choice for it. But he didn't have the professional engineering license. By having all of those things that I had punched along the way, it gave me a leg up to that position.
So, okay, we're back on. Okay, so that was 1970. So you're okay. So now at this point, you've been working for FPL for just about 6 years.
Yeah.
And the promotion to.
Well, I was at that time I was still the district engineer, district relay engineer, in about 1970. The promotion to the manager came. I said I had an MBA. I was working on my MBA when I got that manager's job. I was trying to remember. I don't remember exactly the sequence, but I was either close to getting it. I think I was within 6 months of getting it when the manager's job came up. So I didn't have it, but I finished it up, and I think it was in 1973, and I graduated in 74 after taking 2 more courses to finalize it my last semester. I think it was December of 73 when I got the promotion. And then in 74, I took over that operation, graduated, and then we had some interesting events occur in the 70s, mid-70s, 76, 77, 78. What really happened, it was in 76, if I remember, 1976, we had a blackout on April 3rd, in 1976, I believe it was, when the power system shut down from West Palm Beach to Key West. Everything goes black, about 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, just prior to that, I had been when I was in Fort Lauderdale, and this was in 73 time frame, I believe it was, we put in 12 gas turbine type generators. The company was growing very rapidly. We were getting 10% increase in load every year, and we needed generation. So we built these gas turbines because they were very quick. You could install them in a matter of months, and the company bought 12 of them as a pack. Now these were jet engines, aircraft jet engines, sitting on a test stand, exhausting into an expander that turned the generator. So they were not physical connections, it was just exhaust connections. The jet exhaust turned the generator. They're 25 megawatts each. And I was a division engineer responsible for all the testing and checkout and put these in service, certifying them for the company to put them in service. So we did the test run up and fired them off and stuff like that. And I had put those in the 73 time frame in the summer, because that's when we got it. But anyway, in 76, when we had that blackout, we had put in 24. There was a first group of 12 and then a second group of 12. The following year, we put in another 12. And I was the assistant manager when the second batch was done, so I didn't really participate directly in it, but I was supervising the division guys that put the second batch in, because we put a batch in there and put in another batch at Port Everglades, so we had 36 of those emergency generators. Well, in the blackout of 1976, I was on a temporary assignment to the personnel department in Miami for a rotation program for management trainees. And anyway, I was down there, and I remember I was in one of the general office buildings in an elevator when the power went out. And the elevator was a hydraulic elevator, and so it just, what it does when the power goes up, it just slowly descends to the ground floor, and the doors open. So we got down, and I stepped out and looked around, and there's no power anywhere. So I had a company vehicle, it had a company radio in it, so I got in, called on the radio to find out what's going on. Well, the radio was just people talking everywhere, and I could hardly figure out what it was. But finally, I figured out that we had a blackout, that the whole south end of the state was shut down, and nobody knew what to do. They were screaming at each other over the radio, do this, do this, what happened over here? And anyway, they had lost control of it. So I said, well, I know how to start the power system, because I had put those generators in, so I knew how to do it. So I got in the truck, drove to Fort Lauderdale with no traffic lights, through all the traffic. It was about 50 miles up there. Came into the power plant, couldn't get into the power plant because the gate was electric powered. And all I could hear is the safeties had released on the power plant, the blowing the steam off. The two steam units had both tripped off the line, and they were exhausting the steam to the atmosphere. So it makes a terrific sound. So I climbed over the gate, tore my clothes on it, remember that. Got into the dispatch center for the plant and the switch yard and all, and where we had these emergency generators that I had put in about a year or two before. And it was too many people in there. Everybody had gone in the control center. Everybody's yelling at everybody to do something, and nobody was doing a thing. So I just got in there, and I said, this is ridiculous. So I screamed at everybody, get out. And I said, keep the dispatcher and one switchman, and we'll restart the power system. Everybody else out. So one of the other supervisors says, thank God, somebody's here to take control. And I says, because I was at that time the assistant manager in the area, so they responded to me, and they got out, cleared to the control center, and we had relay panels that had all the remote controls for the jet engines. I had all 24 of them in panels there. It was all manually controlled, electric switches, and relays and stuff like that. And I showed them how to do it. I says, okay, these are air compressor type starting jet engines. They use compressed air. They are black start, means they can start without any remote power. They're running on batteries and compressed air. So I says, okay, the only problem is the storage tanks can only hold 2 to 3 starts. So if they don't fire off, it's 2 engines and they got to fire off equally. Because if you get unbalanced, you unbalance the generator, they won't work. They shut down. So both engines have got to fire off simultaneously and spin up to synchronous speed. And then you put the field on and you make electricity, and then you can start loading them. But you got to load them slowly. Because if you overload them, it's like throwing load on a car. All of a sudden it'll stall out. So you got to raise the system. So I says, okay, we're starting. So I picked the first unit, and I says, okay, we're starting. So we hit the start button on it, and you hear the compressed air and stuff going in, and the units start spinning up. And fortunately, on the first shot, that engine fired off, put the field on, voltage came up, and I said, okay, now then, we're ready to close the main breaker, but we got to close it into a dead system. So we got to pick up a little bit of load. So I said, okay, go into the switch yard and open every circuit breaker. We had about 24 transmission lines out. It's the largest switch yard in the state. So open up all the circuit breakers, and we'll close in one at a time, and we'll feed power over to the steam plant, to the auxiliary transformers, so that they can start firing up the steam unit and get power back to that. Because the only thing on the power plant that they can do is they can protect it, because the lube oil systems run on DC power from the batteries, and they only got a few hours of that before the batteries discharge. But they couldn't start the plant. They have to have outside of power. We'll call it a startup transformer that feeds outside power to start the plant. But anyway, we fed that power around to the plant, and they started preparing to get the steam units back running. And then we said, well, there's one substation just outside of the plant that feeds the local area. And I said, okay, we'll pick that up feeder by feeder. So we switched the lines to that one substation and picked it up. Interesting enough, they said this was planned, but it wasn't. It just happened. I lived about 5 minutes away from the plant. The first feeder we pick up after we restored was the one that I was on. So, okay, benefit, I get power first.
You're the one that's solving the problem. I think that's maybe fair.
But anyway, we started the power system.
Yeah.
And over the next 6 hours, began to restore the load and got all the generators running. The steam plants came back online, and by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we had all the power back up. And says, okay, now we got a big report to write. Figure out, what happened, how it happened, why it happened. Very important. So we got prepared to do that, and so I worked late in the night to getting all that prepared, getting all the notes that people had taken. Because I asked people to take notes. I assigned one person just says, take down everything we do so that you can record it. And anyway, finally went home, and then the next day he came out and says, okay, I went back to Miami to where I was, and I'll be darned, same time, about 2 minutes difference, the system blacks out again on April 4th. Well, this time they knew how to start the system. I didn't have to go back up there and do it. They started the same way I did the day before. And in 2 hours' time, they had everything restored. Well, it took us 6 hours the first time. Training. But anyway, we got the system picked up the second time, and then finally figured out what it was. Is at the nuclear power plant at Turkey Point, there was an inverter in it's in a building room just below the control center that had an outside window on it. And it was electronic controls to the degree that they were back in the 70s. The sun had come up and heated up through the window, hit that inverter, and caused it to overheat. Well, guess what? The sun came up the next day the same time it did the day before. Did it again.
Wow.
But we got it restored. And then after that, I spent lots of time writing reports, going to the company people, telling the officers what happened, how we restored, and this kind of stuff. And
so what procedures came out of that? That?
Well, what they did is they says the problem was, one of the things that came out of that was an event at the nuclear power plants they call loss of off-site power. And it's a major event for a nuclear power plant. You should be self-contained at a nuclear power plant. So from that came regulations about the reliability of nuclear power. Prior to that time, nuclear power was not really anything mysterious. It was a regular coal-fired power plant. It didn't have a coal-fired boiler. The rest of the plant looked like just any other plant. All it had was a nuclear reactor instead of a boiler. It made steam. Yeah. Steam turns a turbine. That's exactly what happens in a coal-fired power plant. So I spent time in Bethesda, Maryland, testifying to the NRC on loss of off-site power. And that over the next few years, I was up there a number of times and had to come up with a process that we could restore power within 30 minutes from a number of different sources to the nuclear power plant. So we came up with a switching procedure of how to do it and then train the people on it.
As a result of those?
As a result of that blackout, of that dual blackout. And in fact, federal regulations came out to affect all nuclear power plants. Florida was unique because we didn't have a corridor for power except one way, north. Most other power systems have interconnections north, south, east, and west. Well, east and west of Florida is water. South is water. Yeah. So it's only one way. So we were kind of stranded on a peninsula. And we had to have power for the nuclear power plants. Well, after that, it's interesting because the manager of, we had another blackout, not as severe, but it was another one caused by overload. Well, one nuclear unit tripped, and he was running the power system. The manager of system operations ran the control center that dispatched all of the power plants and transmission system. That's what the function was, and he was the manager. He was a very good engineer and knew how to run the system. And he felt, the way he felt is that he runs the system and he tells everybody else what to do. But the problem was he couldn't be there 24 hours, 7 days a week. So we had a blackout. It occurred like 6 in the morning one time when a nuclear unit tripped off at Turkey Point, one unit. Both of them were running, one unit tripped. and one transmission line was operated in such a manner that it overloaded and it tripped and cascaded into a pretty major blackout, but not everything. But a good portion of South Florida blacked out due to that. And it was after that in the review that what we call the green table, the executives, vice presidents and stuff get together and they interview the manager of operations about what happened and what you're doing to prevent it. And they were not happy with what he told them. So he was relieved of his position. And they looked around, who has the experience of operations and knew it? Well, I had put all of the power system back together in that 1973 or 76 blackout. And it says, you're the new manager of system operations. So I took over the operations. And the first thing that I says, well, we're going to do things differently. He says, okay, you tell me what we're going to do. I says, first of all, we're going to train the people to run the system. I'm not going to live in that control center the way the manager, the previous manager did. And I says, he lived there. I mean, he actually would come in at about 6 in the morning and stay till about 11 every night. He was running the power system. And it just ruined his health and stuff. He had health problems because of that.
Single point of failure, really.
Yeah, he was a single point of failure. But anyway, I said, I'm not going to do that. And he says, we don't expect you to. We expect you to train the people. He says, you're a good trainer. That's what you did as assistant manager in system protection. He says, train them. And I says, all right, I'm going to use my Navy experience. One thing that I learned during the Cuban crisis, when push comes to shove, I mentioned earlier about the training that we did. We just couldn't get things right on the ship. When we went to general quarters, when it was for real, when we were looking at invasion or attack on a ship, we went to general quarters. And before it had taken, I don't remember the time it took, but it seemed like forever to get everybody to get on station and check in on the headsets that they were in position ready to go to war. During the Cuban crisis, we had an event there when we thought we were being attacked. The ship was being attacked by a submarine. We went to general quarters. I was sitting in the command office at the damage control assistance office, where that was my general quarters station. And I looked at the enlisted guys and I says, what are we going to do with this extra time? Everybody's buttoned up and ready to go. And we did it in a third of the time that it normally was allocated. Before we couldn't even do it. And when it came to real, people just responded. And I says, when it's for real, it works. Training is what you gotta do. So when I took over that manager of system operations, I told the operators, I said, we're going to set up a new classification of system operator that's going to be responsible, and it's going to be one person on shift all the time that's a supervisor in charge of the operation. And he's going to know how to put the system back together. And he's going to be fresh because he's only going to be in the 8 hours a day. So we started the certification program. And it was classroom training for the people who were there. And we had hired a few extras to come in and to run it. And I had 2 assistant managers helping me that train it. And so we set up a training course. And then we bought a simulator that could actually simulate operation of the power system. The final exam was a verbal exam, lasted about 4 to 5 hours, taught by me. That was the final exam. And it got to be known, this is, if you pass that final exam, you know how to run the power system. And I used to run them into the ground. They would ask them questions, okay, this happens, and you can simulate it on the thing. And I can see the guys, the candidates for it, they're sweating bullets. I mean, they're worried that they're not going to do it, because if they didn't pass, they didn't get the job. And it was a pretty well-paid job, and it was always sought after. And I actually trained, we had 8 or 9 candidates, and we got out of that 6 of them passed. And the worst case one that I do remember, it was a kind of a sad case. The guy didn't make it. He went back to a lower job, and he was a very outspoken individual. He was a bargaining unit job steward too. And he was always saying that I was too hard on him and stuff like that. Anyway, I said, you just didn't qualify. Nothing wrong. You can do the slower job. He says, well, I'm the leader in this, and I've got to make it. And I says, I'm sorry. You're not selected. So he said, well, I'm going to take a division job. It's the same job in Sanford. Well, that's where I was started, up in Sanford. And so I said, okay, you can run that office. So he moved up there, and we had a major outage in the Daytona area when a transformer blew up and blacked out the Daytona area. And he was on duty. And that time there's only one dispatcher on in the office running that region. He froze. The system operator called him. Couldn't get him to respond. Says, what are you doing about putting the power? He said, I don't know what to do. Yes, you do. You did the training. You know what to do. I can't do it. So we called in a relief. Came in, put everything back to normal, and about an hour and a half, everything was normal. And he went home. He committed suicide right after he got home. And he froze. And so that's when I've learned that some people are cut out for operators. It's like air traffic controllers. In fact, I modeled the training after what air traffic controllers could do. And when you got an emergency, or the thing of general quarters in the Navy, any kind of operating position, it's hours and hours aboard on routine stuff, and then an emergency happens, and you got to respond without panicking. And some people can't do that. There's no reflection on them. They can do other jobs. Maybe great design engineers, but under pressure, they break. Airline pilot has that type of training. So there's a number of jobs to do it. So I learned that in the Navy, applied it there, and from that point on, things ran much smoother. We did have one more blackout after I got all of that set up, and that occurred a few years later after we had built 500 kV transmission lines into the Miami area, all the way to Macon, Georgia, bringing power. The company could not get any coal-fired power plants built in Florida. The Department of Environmental Regulation down there just would not permit a coal-fired power plant in South Florida. So we couldn't get a new plant built. We actually spent $1 million on a site development and plans, and worked out with the railroads. I had done some negotiating with the railroads for coal delivery. And they turned us down on the Power Plant Siting Act. Was the governor and the cabinet with that final say in doing it. And we had all of our ducks in a row, went to them, and they said, we're not going to approve it. And the head of the environmental department in Florida says, we're not going to build a coal-fired power plant in Florida as long as I'm here. She eventually became the head of the EPA. So we abandoned the plans and built the power lines to Georgia, because Georgia was still building coal-fired power plants. And we bought a plant in near Macon, Plant Shira, Unit 4, and Southern Company built in Macon, Georgia, and we built two 500 kV lines from Macon, Georgia, all the way to South Florida. And the final blackout happened when a fire in the Everglades. There was actually 3 lines coming out of a substation in West Broward County called, what do we call that? Andytown substation. I think that's what it was. It fed into the Miami area. And the fire got in the 3 transmission lines. They were spaced about 200 feet apart, but the sawgrass had caught on fire. In fact, I flew over it in a helicopter after we had the trouble and we got the power back. But anyway, the fire line, we were up at about 400 feet, and as far as you could see to the horizon, there was a fire moving through the Everglades. And all Fort Lauderdale, Miami was just black with soot and stuff. So it took out the 3 lines feeding in that area, and we blacked out everything from, actually as in Miami area, not Fort Lauderdale, but Fort Lauderdale stayed in hot, but Miami area blacked out. And since we had that, and I had everything for it. We came up with some new procedures and how to do it, and how to stay out of that trouble. And that was the last one we had the whole time I was there as the operation manager. And from eventually, my boss was promoted again, and I had relieved it from him. He was the director of power supply, which had operations of the system, the protection, the field engineers for all the protection system, had a wholesale contracts group, and I think that was it in that time. Anyway, he took over as the vice president of that and designated me as the director of power supply. So I took over operation of all of those, the director of power supply.
And that would have been in what year?
Let's see, that was about 82, 83, somewhere along in there. I had been operations almost about 8 years, manager of operations. Well, one thing as manager of operations that I didn't mention is a major thing.
Can we pause 1 second?
Okay.